The poor black single mom whispered, "Don't worry, baby. We'll afford soon, I promise," as she returned the baby milk she desperately needed. And the billionaire standing behind her froze, watching a moment that would shatter his 3 years of numbness and reveal a connection so impossible it would change both their lives forever. Before we dive into this incredible true story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from right now. I want to know this story is reaching hearts across the world. Make sure to watch till Chapter 9 where the story gets more interesting. Now let's dive into Chapter 1. Elias Roden pushed through the glass doors of Miller's Grocery on a Tuesday morning that felt like drowning. The automatic whoosh of air doing nothing to fill the hollow space in his chest where his wife used to live. Today marks 3 years since Grace died. 3 years since he watched her final breath leave her body in that sterile hospital room. 3 years since he became a billionaire with everything except a reason to wake up. He moved through the aisles without seeing them, his hand reaching for a bottle of scotch because numbness was the only companion he trusted anymore, because grief had taught him that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and somewhere between the cereal and the cleaning supplies, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. A woman's voice, tight with controlled panic, speaking words that sliced through his fog like a blade. "I just need to return this." Elias turned his head without meaning to, his body responding to desperation the way animals respond to distress calls in the wild. Across the aisle stood a black woman in her late 20s, her clothes clean but worn thin from too many washes, her shoulders carrying the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. She held a carton of baby milk in hands that trembled just slightly, and in her other arm sat a child no older than 8 months, his small chest rising and falling with effort, his face flushed with fever that even Elias could see from 15 feet away. The cashier, a thin woman with gray roots showing through cheap dye, scanned the milk with the enthusiasm of someone counting hours until freedom. "Your card declined." Those 3 words landed in the quiet store like stones dropped in still water, rippling outward, touching everything. The woman at the register, this stranger whose name Elias didn't know yet, closed her eyes for just a second, and in that second he saw something he recognized because he'd worn it himself after Grace died. Defeat that had been practiced so many times it almost looked like acceptance. "Can you try it again?" Her voice stayed steady, stayed dignified, stayed strong in a way that made Elias's throat tighten because he understood that kind of strength, the kind that only came from having no other choice. The cashier sighed like the request was a personal insult, swiped the card again, and the machine beeped its rejection with mechanical cruelty. Still declined. The baby in her arms coughed, a wet rattling sound that spoke of things left untreated, of choices between medicine and rent, of a system that ground people down and called it fairness. Elias stood frozen in his aisle, the scotch bottle still in his hand, watching the scene unfold like a play he'd been forced to attend. The woman straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and said with quiet dignity that cut deeper than any scream, "I understand. I'll come back later." But they both knew there was no later, no magic windfall coming, no cavalry riding over the hill. She turned to leave, and that's when Elias saw him. A man standing near the entrance, tall and broad with the kind of face that looked carved from something harder than bone. Watched the woman with eyes that tracked her movements like a predator calculating distance. His leather jacket was too expensive for this neighborhood, his boots too clean, his smile too cold when he caught the woman looking back at him. She flinched. Just a small movement, barely noticeable. But Elias had spent years reading body language in boardrooms, and he knew fear when he saw it. The man, this shadow in human form, noticed Elias noticing him, and something dark flickered across his face before he smiled wider, a wolf bearing teeth. The woman walked faster toward the door, the baby bouncing in her arms, her whole body screaming flight without running, and Elias felt something stir in the deadness inside him, something he thought had died with Grace. What happened in the next 60 seconds would set everything in motion, but in that moment, Elias Roden just stood in aisle 7 of a grocery store on the worst day of his year, watching a poor woman leave, without milk for her sick baby, watching a dangerous man follow her with his eyes, and feeling for the first time in 3 years that maybe numbness wasn't what he needed after all. The automatic doors slid open and she disappeared into the cold morning, the predator's gaze following her like a promise, and Elias made a choice that would unravel secrets he never knew existed and reveal a connection that would make him question everything he thought he understood about fate, coincidence, and the woman who had just walked out of his sight, but not, he was beginning to realize, out of his life. Elias's feet moved before his brain gave permission, the Scotch bottle abandoned on a shelf as he pushed through the doors into air so cold it burned his lungs, his eyes scanning the parking lot until they found her, the woman moving fast toward the bus stop with her baby clutched against her chest like a shield. He called out without thinking, his voice carrying across the empty morning, "Wait, please." She didn't stop, didn't slow down, her pace quickening, instead, as if his voice was just another threat in a life that had taught her to trust nothing that sounded too good. Elias jogged to close the distance, his expensive shoes slapping against cracked pavement, and when he got close enough to see her face properly, he understood that she wasn't running from danger. She was protecting herself from hope. "I saw what happened in there," he said, slightly breathless, his hand reaching toward his wallet. "Let me help. Let me pay for the milk, for whatever you need." She stopped then, turned to face him with eyes that held no gratitude, no relief, just a weary kind of anger that came from being offered charity one too many times by people who treated kindness like a transaction. "I don't need your help." For words delivered with such controlled fury that Elias actually stepped back, stunned by the force of her dignity. The baby in her arms coughed again, that same wet rattle that sounded like drowning from the inside, and she adjusted him with practiced ease, her jaw tight, her spine straight. "I'm fine, we're fine, you can go back to your shopping." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what 3 years of grief had taught him to recognize in others, the weight of carrying too much alone, the exhaustion of fighting battles that never ended, the pride that was the last thing left when everything else had been stripped away. "You collapsed in that store," he lied, testing her, wanting to understand why she would refuse something so simple as help for her sick child. "No, I didn't," she shot back immediately, her eyes narrowing with suspicion that cut like broken glass. "Why are you following me? What do you want?" The question hung between them in the freezing air, and Elias realized he didn't have a good answer, because he didn't know himself. Didn't understand why this stranger's suffering had pierced through 3 years of numbness when nothing else had. "I just want to make sure you're okay," he said. And even to his own ears it sounded weak, insufficient, like trying to hold back an ocean with open palms. She laughed then, a sound without humor, sharp and bitter and final. "You want to make sure I'm okay? You don't know me, you don't know what okay looks like in my life, and you definitely don't get to show up offering money like that fixes anything." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, revealing the exhaustion underneath the armor, and Elias saw her blink rapidly. Fighting back tears she refused to let fall in front of a stranger. "My name is Elias," he offered quietly, trying to build a bridge across the chasm of mistrust between them. "I don't care," she replied, shifting the baby higher on her hip, and the child whimpered. Small, feverish sounds that made Elias want to grab them both and drag them to a hospital whether she agreed or not. "Your baby needs a doctor," he pressed, abandoning pretense, going straight for the truth that neither of them could avoid. "He's coughing, he's burning up, this isn't something you can wait out." Her face went hard, a door slamming shut, and when she spoke her voice carried the weight of every judgment she'd ever received, every assumption ever made about her worth. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't been trying? You think I chose to return that milk because I wanted to?" The questions came like bullets, and Elias had no shield, no defense, nothing but the growing understanding that he had stepped into waters far deeper than he'd imagined. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it, but sorry was just another word that changed nothing, fixed nothing, fed no babies or paid no bills. She turned away from him, started walking again. And that's when Elias saw the man from the grocery store leaning against a lamppost 50 yards away, watching him with that same predatory focus, and something cold slithered down Elias's spine. "Do you know that man?" he asked, his voice dropping low with instinctive warning. She glanced back, saw where Elias was looking, and her entire body went rigid with fear, so raw it was like watching someone touched by live wire. "Stay away from me," she whispered, but this time the command carried no strength, just terror barely contained, and she moved faster toward the bus stop where a handful of other people waited in the morning cold. Elias followed at a distance, watching the man watching her, understanding without being told that whatever was happening here was bigger than a declined card, deeper than poverty, more dangerous than he'd initially understood. The bus rounded the corner, its brakes squealing, and the woman stepped toward the curb, the baby's cries getting louder, more distressed, and then everything happened at once. She stumbled, her knees buckling, her body swaying like a tree cut at the base, and Elias lunged forward on instinct, catching her before she hit the concrete, the baby trapped safely between them as other people rushed over, voices rising in concern. Her eyes rolled back, consciousness slipping, and up close Elias could see the hollows under her cheekbones, the chapped lips, the signs of someone who'd been running on empty for so long they'd forgotten what full felt like. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted, but Elias was already pulling out his phone, already barking orders, already making decisions for this stranger who'd rejected his help 60 seconds ago, but who now lay unconscious in his arms with a sick baby crying against his chest. The man by the lamppost straightened, took 2 steps forward, and then stopped when Elias made direct eye contact, a silent challenge passing between them that needed no words. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, and the woman's eyes fluttered open, confused and frightened, her first instinct to pull away, even in her weakened state. "You're okay," Elias said softly, lying because nothing about this was okay, nothing about watching someone collapse from exhaustion and malnutrition, and fear was anywhere close to okay. "Let me go," she breathed, but there was no strength behind it, just resignation that tasted like ash. The ambulance pulled up, paramedics jumping out, and as they loaded her onto a stretcher with the baby still in her arms, she looked at Elias with eyes that held a warning he didn't yet understand. "You'll regret getting involved with someone like me," she said, and then the ambulance doors closed and she was gone, leaving Elias standing in a parking lot wondering what force had just collided with his carefully constructed numbness and shattered it completely, wondering who that man was and why his smile as the ambulance drove away looked less like concern and more like a promise of violence yet to come. The ambulance disappeared around the corner, and Elias stood frozen in the parking lot like a man who'd just witnessed a car crash, his hand still tingling from where he'd caught her, the memory of her weight collapsing into him, playing on repeat in his mind. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, returning to their buses and their lives, but one woman remained, an older black woman in a nurse's uniform who looked at Elias with eyes that carried knowledge he didn't want but needed. "You don't know her, do you?" the woman asked, and it wasn't really a question, more like an observation wrapped in warning. Elias shook his head, suddenly aware of how insane this all looked, a stranger chasing down a woman in a parking lot, catching her when she fell, standing here now like he had any right to be involved. "Her name is Keisha," the woman continued, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a register meant for secrets and confessions. "Keisha Morgan, and those debts she's drowning in, they aren't even hers." The words landed like stones in water, ripples spreading outward, and Elias found himself leaning in despite every logical part of his brain screaming that he should walk away, get in his car, return to his empty mansion and his expensive scotch and his comfortable numbness. "What do you mean they're not hers?" he asked, and the woman glanced over her shoulder like she was checking for witnesses before answering. "That man you saw watching her, that's Damon Rook, Malik's father, and he's the reason she can't breathe without drowning." The name Damon Rook settled into Elias's consciousness like poison, and suddenly the predatory watching made perfect sense. The way Keisha had frozen when she saw him, the terror that had overwhelmed her dignity. "He left her when she was pregnant," the woman continued, her voice hardening with the kind of anger that came from watching injustice up close. "Disappeared for months, then came back after the baby was born demanding rights, demanding control, demanding she pay off his debts or he'd take Malik and disappear where she'd never find him." Elias felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, a rage he hadn't felt in 3 years bubbling up from somewhere deep and primal. The same rage he'd felt watching Grace die slowly while he stood helpless. The same impotent fury at systems and people and circumstances that crushed the innocent without mercy. "Why doesn't she go to police?" he asked, knowing even as the words left his mouth how naive they sounded. How much privilege dripped from the assumption that law enforcement was protection rather than threat. The woman laughed, bitter and knowing. "Baby, the police don't help people like Keisha. They complicate things. They ask questions about custody and living situations. And somehow she ends up being the one under investigation, while Damon walks free with his record sealed and his lawyers paid." The bus pulled up then, brakes hissing, and the woman moved toward it before turning back one last time. That girl has been fighting alone her whole life, and Damon knows it, counts on it, uses it against her every single day. So if you're thinking about getting involved, you better be ready for war, because that man doesn't lose gracefully, and he definitely doesn't forget. The bus doors closed and she was gone, leaving Elias standing in an empty parking lot with information that felt like responsibility, with knowledge that couldn't be unknown, with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. He drove to the hospital without planning to, his hands guiding the steering wheel on autopilot, while his mind spun through everything he'd just learned. Keisha Morgan's name repeating like a prayer or a curse, depending on how you looked at it. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and desperation, and Elias approached the desk with the kind of confidence that money bought, asking about a woman and baby brought in 20 minutes ago. The nurse looked at him with professional skepticism. "Are you family?" she asked, and Elias opened his mouth to lie, to claim some connection that would grant him access. But the words died when he saw Keisha through the small window in the treatment room door, sitting on the edge of a bed with Malik in her arms, tears streaming down her face in total silence. She looked so small in that moment, so completely defeated, and Elias understood with sudden clarity that she'd been holding everything together through sheer force of will, that the collapse in the parking lot wasn't just physical exhaustion, but the accumulated weight of fighting battles no one should fight alone. "I'm not family," he admitted to the nurse, turning away from the window. "I just wanted to make sure they were okay." The nurse's expression softened slightly, recognition of good intentions, even if they couldn't be accommodated. "The baby has a respiratory infection, needs antibiotics and monitoring, but she doesn't have insurance, and she's trying to figure out how to pay. So if you're looking to help, that's where she needs it." Elias pulled out his wallet, extracted his black card, and placed it on the counter with the kind of casual authority that came from never having to worry about money. "Whatever they need, whatever it costs, put it on this, and make sure she doesn't know who paid." The nurse stared at the card, then at Elias, her eyes widening with recognition because his name was on buildings and in newspapers and attached to the kind of wealth most people only imagined. "Mr. Odin," she breathed, and he raised a finger to his lips, a request for discretion that she nodded at immediately. "Not a word," he said. "She doesn't need to know. She just needs to breathe." He left before Keisha could see him, before he could talk himself out of what he'd just done, before the rational part of his brain could point out that he was getting involved in something he didn't understand with a woman who'd made it clear she wanted nothing from him. The drive home felt longer than usual, his mansion looming at the end of the long driveway like a mausoleum built for the living, all that space and silence and expensive furniture that meant nothing to anyone. He poured himself scotch and stood by the window watching the sunset, thinking about Keisha Morgan and her sick baby and the debts that weren't hers, and the man named Damon Rook who apparently terrorized her with impunity. 3 years ago, Elias would have written a check and moved on, would have treated charity like a transaction that absolved him of further involvement. But 3 years of grief had changed something fundamental in him, had burned away the comfortable distance between himself and other people's suffering. His phone buzzed with an email from his assistant. Routine business that suddenly felt meaningless compared to the image of Keisha's tears in that hospital room. And Elias made a decision that would either redeem him or destroy him, depending on how the story ended. He opened his laptop and typed a name into the search bar, Sloan Merritt, the best private investigator money could buy, someone who found answers that others missed and kept secrets that needed keeping. The email he sent was brief, just a name and a request. Find out everything about Keisha Morgan and Damon Rook and why a woman would rather collapse in a parking lot than accept help from a stranger. What could drive someone to that edge of desperation? And could you watch someone drown without trying to pull them out even if they fought you the whole way? Elias stared at his reflection in the darkened window, seeing a man he barely recognized, someone who'd spent 3 years hiding from life, suddenly walking straight toward the messiest, most complicated situation imaginable. And for the first time since Grace died, he felt something that almost resembled purpose. The scotch sat untouched on the table, its numbing promise suddenly less appealing than the sharp clarity of knowing he'd made a choice that mattered. That somewhere in the city Keisha Morgan was probably being discharged with antibiotics she didn't know a stranger had paid for, probably riding a bus home with her baby, wondering how she'd survive another day. Probably terrified of the moment Damon Rook would show up again with his demands and his threats and his suffocating control. Elias closed his laptop and made a promise to the empty room, to Grace's memory, to the universe that had somehow put Keisha Morgan in his path on the worst day of his year. He wouldn't let her drown alone, wouldn't walk away like everyone else had, wouldn't let Damon Rook win whatever sick game he was playing. And if that made him foolish or reckless or dangerously naive, then so be it, because numbness had stopped being enough the moment he caught a collapsing woman and felt her heartbeat against his chest and understood that some things were worth the risk of feeling again. Sloane Merritt arrived at Elias's mansion 3 days later, carrying a manila folder that felt heavier than paper should. Her expression grim in the way that told him the answers he'd paid for weren't the ones he'd wanted to find. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, the kind of investigator who found truth in places others were too afraid to look. And when she spread the contents of that folder across his dining table, Elias felt something cold settle into his bones. Keisha Morgan, 27 years old, works 2 jobs, one cleaning offices at night and another serving breakfast at a diner starting at 5 in the morning. Sloane began, her finger tapping a photo of Keisha in a stained apron looking exhausted under fluorescent lights. She's 3 months behind on rent, has 17 unpaid medical bills, no family support, no safety net, and a baby who's been sick on and off for 4 months because she can't afford consistent health care. Elias stared at the documents, bank statements showing balances that never rose. Above double digits, eviction notices stamped with red warnings, collection agency letters piled, so high they'd become wallpaper to her life. The apartment building she lives in has 4 code violations, black mold in the walls, heat that works maybe half the time, and neighbors who've been arrested for everything from drug dealing to assault. Sloane continued, pulling out more photos that showed a building that looked like it was held together by spite and desperation. And Damon Rook? Elias asked, though part of him didn't want to know, didn't want confirmation of the darkness he'd seen in that man's eyes. Sloane's jaw tightened, her professional detachment cracking just slightly. Damon Rook is a predator with a record sealed by expensive lawyers and connections to people who make problems disappear. He's got warrants in 2 states, 3 restraining orders from previous partners, and a pattern of targeting vulnerable women, getting them pregnant, then using the children as leverage for money and control. The words settled into the room like smoke, suffocating and inescapable, and Elias felt rage building in his chest, the kind that made hands shake and vision narrow. He doesn't want to be a father. He wants child support payments to fund his lifestyle, and he's threatened Keisha that if she doesn't pay his debts, he'll take Malik and disappear where she'll never find him. And given his connections and her complete lack of resources, it's not an empty threat. Sloane slid another document across the table, a grainy surveillance photo that made Elias's blood run cold. This was taken 2 nights ago outside Keisha's building. That's Damon going inside at 11 p.m. The image showed Damon Rook entering the building with the posture of someone who owned the place, who knew no one would stop him, who counted on fear to pave his path. What happened? Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Neighbors reported shouting, crying, sounds of things breaking. But no one called the police, because in that neighborhood, calling police often makes things worse. And by the time I got someone inside to check, Damon was gone, and Keisha wasn't answering her door. Elias stood abruptly, the chair scraping against hardwood, every cell in his body screaming to do something, fix something, stop standing around discussing horror like it was data to be analyzed. I need her address, he said, and Sloane looked at him with an expression that mixed concern with recognition. Mr. Odin, getting involved in a domestic situation like this is complicated. There are legal ramifications, personal safety concerns, and the very real possibility that your presence could escalate things rather than help. Her warnings bounced off him like rain off stone because 3 years of numbness had given way to something fierce and protective. Something that remembered what it felt like to care about another person's suffering, as if it were his own. The address Sloan, he repeated, and she sighed, pulling out her phone and texting him the information with the reluctance of someone enabling what might be a terrible decision. Elias drove across the city as evening fell, the neighborhoods getting progressively rougher, until he pulled up outside a building that looked like it had given up on dignity sometime in the previous decade, its brick facade crumbling, windows covered with bars, graffiti screaming territorial claims in spray paint. He sat in his car for 10 minutes, watching people come and go, wondering what he thought he could accomplish here, wondering if Keisha would even let him through the door, or if she'd call him a stalker and threaten to call the police. The decision was made for him when he saw Damon Rook emerge from a car parked across the street, saw him walk toward the building entrance with the casual confidence of someone who'd made this trip before, and Elias was out of his vehicle and moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct. He followed Damon inside, upstairs that smelled like urine and despair, down a hallway lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes, and stopped when he heard the shouting coming from apartment 3C. Damon's voice loud and aggressive, words muffled by walls, but tone unmistakable. "You think you can just ignore me? You think you don't have to pay?" Keisha's voice, quieter but defiant, that same dignity wrapped in steel that Elias had heard in the parking lot. "I don't owe you anything. Those are your debts, your choices, your consequences." The sound of something shattering, glass or ceramic, followed by Malik's terrified crying. And Elias stood at the door with his hand raised to knock, torn between boundaries and responsibility, between respecting her wishes and protecting someone who clearly needed protection. What would you do if you heard someone you tried to help being terrorized behind a locked door? Would you walk away to preserve their autonomy or break down the barrier to ensure their safety? The door opened before he could decide, Keisha standing there with tears on her cheeks and fire in her eyes, her voice shaking but strong when she said, "You shouldn't be here." Behind her, Elias could see the apartment, small and sparse, furniture that looked salvaged, walls water-stained, and Damon Rook sitting on her couch like he owned it, his glare venomous when he saw Elias. "Who's this?" Damon asked, standing slowly, his body language shifting into threat. "Nobody," Keisha said quickly, too quickly, fearing bleeding through her words. "Just someone from the grocery store checking on us." Damon moved closer, sizing Elias up with the assessment of someone used to violence, and Elias held his ground despite every survival instinct screaming retreat. "The grocery store guy needs to learn about boundaries," Damon said, his smile cold and promising pain. Elias looked past him to Keisha, saw the bruise forming on her arm, saw Malik crying in a playpen that was missing a wheel, saw a life held together by threads so thin they could snap with one more pull. "I'll leave," Elias said, backing toward the door, knowing he was outmatched here, knowing confrontation would only make things worse. "Good choice," Damon replied, and Keisha's eyes met Elias's for just a second, a silent plea that could have meant help me or leave me alone. And he couldn't tell which, so he retreated, walked back down those stairs, got in his car, and made one more call to Sloan with instructions that would either save Keisha Morgan or destroy whatever fragile stability she'd managed to build in her impossible life. The call came at 2 a.m, Sloan's voice cutting through Elias's restless half-sleep with words that launched him out of bed like a gunshot. "It's happening now. Neighbors are reporting screaming. You need to get there immediately if you're serious about this." Elias didn't bother with shoes that matched or a jacket that made sense, just grabbed his keys and ran to his car, the city at night blurring past his windows as he broke every speed limit between his mansion and that crumbling building where Keisha was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. The sound reached him before he even entered the building, Damon's roar of rage echoing down the stairwell. Furniture crashing, Malik's screams so shrill they didn't sound human, and Elias took the stairs 3 at a time until he reached 3C where the door hung partially open, broken at the lock. What he saw when he pushed inside would stay burned into his memory forever. Keisha on the floor near the kitchen, her lips split and bleeding, her body curled. Protectively, even though Damon wasn't touching her anymore, just standing over her with fists clenched and breathing hard like an animal that had worn itself out on violence. Malik was in his playpen screaming with a desperation that spoke of hours of terror, his little face purple with effort. His cough so severe he was gasping between cries, and the apartment itself looked like a tornado had torn through it. Everything breakable broken, everything that could be destroyed destroyed. "Get out," Damon snarled when he saw Elias. But there was something different in his eyes now, uncertainty, maybe, or the dawning realization that witnesses complicated things. Elias moved past him without responding, dropped to his knees beside Keisha and touched her shoulder gently, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get you out of here, both of you, right now." She looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, just exhaustion, so complete it looked like surrender. "He'll find me," she whispered, her voice raw from screaming or crying or both. "He always finds me. There's nowhere I can go that he won't follow." Damon laughed, the sound ugly and triumphant. "That's right. You think some rich boy showing up changes anything? She's mine. The kid is mine. And she owes me everything until I say something different." Elias stood slowly, something cold and dangerous settling into his chest, the same feeling he'd had in boardrooms when opponents underestimated him, when people mistook his patience for weakness and his politeness for softness. "Touch her again, and I will destroy you," he said quietly, each word deliberate and heavy with promise. "I will use every resource I have, every connection, every dollar, every second of every day to make sure you lose everything, your freedom, your safety, your ability to hurt anyone ever again." Damon stepped forward, violence radiating off him like heat. "Are you threatening me?" Elias didn't back down, didn't flinch, just held his ground with the certainty of someone who'd finally found something worth fighting for after 3 years of feeling nothing. "I'm making you a guarantee. Walk away now, or find out exactly how much power a billionaire with nothing to lose can bring down on one person." The moments stretched between them, tension so thick it felt solid, and then Damon smiled that cold predator smile and backed toward the door. "This isn't over, not even close. I've got lawyers, I've got rights, and I will take that kid from her just to watch her break." He left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, and Elias turned back to Keisha, who was trying to stand, trying to pull herself together, trying to be strong even though her whole body trembled with shock and pain. "Don't," she said when Elias reached for her. "Don't help me. Don't save me. Don't make this worse by giving me hope that something could change." Malik's coughing fit intensified, his small body convulsing with the effort to breathe, and Keisha's defiance crumbled as she stumbled toward the playpen, lifting her baby with hands that shook so badly she almost dropped him. "He needs a doctor," Elias said, stating the obvious, because sometimes the obvious was all you had. "I know he needs a doctor," Keisha shot back, anger flaring through her fear. "You think I don't know that? You think I'm choosing to let my baby suffer?" She was crying now, tears mixing with blood from her split lip, her whole world collapsing and taking her down with it. "He wants Malik for the child support money," she choked out, the words tumbling like confession. "He doesn't care about being a father. He just wants the monthly payments, wants to use my baby as an ATM. And if I don't pay off his gambling debts, his drug debts, all the money he owes to people who would kill him for it. He says he'll take Malik, somewhere I'll never find him." The truth landed between them, ugly and undeniable. And Elias understood finally the full scope of what he'd walked into. Not just domestic violence, but systematic abuse. Not just a bad relationship, but calculated torture designed to keep Keisha trapped and bleeding money she didn't have. "Get what you need, we're going to the hospital," Elias said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I can't afford the hospital," Keisha replied, defeat heavy in every syllable. "I already owe them thousands. They'll treat him, but then I'll have more debt, more bills, more reasons for Damon to say I'm unfit, more ammunition for him to take Malik away." Could someone be punished for trying to save their child's life? Could the system be so broken that seeking medical help became another weapon in an abuser's arsenal? Elias pulled out his phone, dialed, and when Sloan answered, he gave instructions that would either redeem him or bankrupt him, depending on how you measured worth. "I need a car here in 5 minutes. Private security. a hospital room arranged at Presbyterian under a false name, and a lawyer who specializes in custody cases standing by in the morning. Price is not a concern. Speed is everything. He hung up and looked at Keisha, who stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. And it was the same question he'd been asking himself since that moment in the grocery store when he'd chosen to care instead of walking away. "Because 3 years ago my wife died and a stranger held her hand in the hospital," Elias said, the words coming from somewhere deep and true. "Someone I didn't know gave her comfort when I was too broken to be strong, and I never got to thank them, never got to pay back that kindness. So maybe this is the universe giving me a second chance." Keisha's face crumpled, some final wall breaking inside her, and when she spoke her voice was small and young and terrified. "What if he wins anyway? What if all this just makes him angrier? What if I lose Malik because he tried to help?" Elias took Malik from her arms as another coughing fit seized the baby, the child's breathing labored and concerned, and he met Keisha's eyes with absolute conviction. "Then we fight harder, we fight smarter, and we make sure Damon Rook learns that some people have armies behind them even when they think they're alone." Car lights flashed through the broken window, Sloane's efficiency on display, and Elias guided Keisha toward the door, away from the apartment that had been her prison, toward a future that was uncertain, but at least offered the possibility of survival. And as they descended those stairs with Malik gasping in his arms, Elias made a silent promise to Grace's memory that this time he wouldn't fail. This time he would be strong enough to save someone. This time the ending would be different even if it cost him everything. The hospital admitted Malik under a false name with security posted outside the room, and Elias watched from the hallway as doctors worked on the baby whose respiratory infection had progressed to something dangerous, whose small body fought for breath while his mother sat beside the bed, whispering prayers to a God she probably stopped believing in years ago. Keisha had refused treatment for her own injuries, the split lip and bruises decorating her arms like a road map of Damon's fury, insisting the doctors focus only on Malik, while she bled quietly into tissues the nurses kept bringing her. Elias paid for everything anonymously through accounts that couldn't be traced, knowing that Keisha's pride would reject charity even as her circumstances demanded it. And he stood in that fluorescent hallway at 4 in the morning wondering how someone could. "Lawyer will be here at 8. His name is Marcus Chun, and he's never lost a custody case. But you need to see something before we move forward." She handed him the folder, and Elias opened it expecting more documentation of Damon's crimes, more evidence of Keisha's suffering. But what he found instead stopped his heart completely. It was a photograph, grainy and faded, dated 3 years and 2 months ago, taken in this very hospital on a night Elias remembered with perfect clarity because it was the night Grace died. The image showed a hospital corridor, and there in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, stood a younger Keisha Morgan, visibly pregnant, her hand clasped with someone just out of frame. "Keep looking," Sloane said quietly, and Elias flipped to the next photo, this one clearer, showing Keisha sitting beside a hospital bed, and in that bed lay Grace, his wife, her face peaceful despite the tubes and monitors, and their hands were intertwined like old friends sharing final moments. The world tilted sideways, reality rearranging itself into patterns Elias couldn't process, his brain trying to reconcile the stranger from the grocery store with this woman who'd been present during the worst night of his life. "I pulled hospital records after you asked me to investigate Keisha," Sloane explained, her voice gentle because she understood the magnitude of what she was revealing. "She was in the ER that night for pregnancy complications, on the same floor as your wife. And according to the nurse's notes, she spent 2 hours sitting with Grace, talking to her, praying with her, holding her hand while you were meeting with doctors about end-of-life decisions." Elias's hands shook so badly the photos blurred. 3 years of grief crashing into this impossible coincidence, this connection that felt less like chance and more like the universe's cruel sense of poetry. "Grace died alone," he whispered, the guilt he'd carried since that night rising up to choke him. "I left her room to sign papers, to make calls, to handle logistics, and when I came back she was gone. I thought she died completely alone." Sloane placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him before he spiraled. "She didn't die alone. Keisha was there, a stranger who saw someone suffering and chose compassion over convenience. who gave your wife comfort in her final moments, even though she had her own crisis to deal with, even though she was scared and pregnant and probably in pain. The information rewrote everything Elias thought he understood about fate and purpose, and why he'd been standing in that grocery store on the anniversary of Grace's death, why his numbness had shattered at the sight of Keisha's suffering, why some invisible thread had pulled him into her life with such force he couldn't resist. Does she know? He asked, meaning does Keisha remember Grace, remember that night, remember being the angel who'd stayed when everyone else had left? I don't think so, Sloan replied, pulling up more records on her tablet. Look at the timeline. She sat with Grace from 10 until midnight, then went into emergency labor, had Malik prematurely, spent 3 days in intensive care. Her whole world imploded that same night, and traumatic memory does strange things. She probably doesn't connect your wife to you at all. Elias stared through the window at Keisha, who sat exhausted beside Malik's bed. This woman who'd saved his wife from dying alone. This woman who'd given him a gift he never knew he'd received. And the debt he owed her suddenly felt infinite and impossible to repay. How do you thank someone for being present during your darkest moment, when they don't even remember their own kindness? How do you explain that the universe had brought you back together in a grocery store 3 years later so you could return the favor? He walked into the room without planning his words, sat down across from Keisha, who looked at him with exhaustion and wariness. The doctors say Malik will be okay, she said, her voice hollow with relief and disbelief. They're giving him antibiotics, oxygen therapy. They say he'll recover fully. And when I asked about payment, they said it was already handled, that someone had covered everything. She looked at him with eyes that knew but didn't want to confirm. That was you, wasn't it? You paid for this, for everything. Elias wanted to tell her about Grace, about the photograph, about the connection that made this moment feel ordained rather than accidental. But the words stuck in his throat, because how do you explain destiny to someone who stopped believing in good things happening? You don't owe me anything, he said instead, deflecting. Yes, I do, Keisha shot back, anger rising through her exhaustion. I owe you everything, and I hate it. I hate being in debt, hate being rescued, hate feeling like I can't survive on my own. Her honesty cut deeper than any accusation could, and Elias recognized the same pride that had made her reject help in the parking lot, the same dignity that kept her standing even when life kept knocking her down. 3 years ago, someone helped my wife when she was dying, Elias said quietly, the truth spilling out before he could stop it. A stranger sat with her, held her hand, made sure she wasn't alone in her final moments, and I never knew who it was, never got to say thank you. Never got to tell them what that meant. Keisha's face shifted, something flickering in her memory. A door opening to a night she'd probably tried to forget. What was your wife's name? She asked, her voice barely audible. Grace, Elias replied. Grace Roden. She died in this hospital on a Tuesday night 3 years ago while I was signing papers and making calls and being everywhere except where I should have been. Recognition bloomed across Keisha's face, color draining as memory crashed back, her hand flying to her mouth. The woman in room 408, she whispered. She was so scared, kept asking for someone named Elias, kept saying she didn't want to die alone. And I was waiting for test results, and I heard her crying, so I just sat with her. I don't even know why. I just couldn't walk past someone in that much pain. Tears streamed down both their faces now. 3 years of grief and guilt, an impossible coincidence, colliding in a hospital room, while a baby slept peacefully between them. You gave her peace, Elias said, his voice breaking. You gave me a gift I didn't know I had. And when I saw you in that grocery store returning milk for your sick baby, I didn't know why I couldn't walk away. But now I understand. The universe was giving me a chance to pay back a debt I didn't even know I owed. Keisha shook her head, overwhelmed by the weight of connection, by the impossible timing, by the realization that 3 years ago their lives had intersected in tragedy, and now they'd collided again in crisis. I don't believe in fate, she said, but her voice carried no conviction. Neither did I, Elias replied, looking at Malik, who breathed easier now thanks to medicine and intervention, and the collision of two broken people who'd been tied together by grief long before they knew each other's names. And in that moment everything changed because debt became partnership, charity became justice, and two strangers bound by death found themselves fighting together for life. Marcus Chun arrived at 8 in the morning, carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Keisha's monthly rent. His suit sharp enough to cut glass. His reputation preceding him like thunder before lightning. He sat across from Keisha in a private consultation room and laid out the reality with surgical precision. No sugarcoating, no false hope. Just cold, hard legal truth that made her hands tremble against the table. Damon Rook has filed for joint custody with a petition for child support retroactive to Malik's birth, Marcus said, sliding papers across the table that turned Keisha's worst nightmare into official documentation. He's claiming you've denied him access to his son, that you've been uncooperative about visitation, and that he deserves equal parenting time plus financial compensation for the months he's been excluded from Malik's life. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Damon, who'd disappeared during her pregnancy, who'd threatened and abused and terrorized her, now presenting himself to the court as a loving father denied his rights by a vindictive mother. He's lying, Keisha said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. He doesn't want to be a father. He wants money. He wants control. He wants to punish me for existing. Marcus nodded like he'd heard this story 1,000 times before. I believe you, but what matters is what we can prove in court. And Damon has hired Victor Salazar, one of the best family law attorneys in the state, someone who specializes in making bad fathers look sympathetic and struggling mothers look unstable. Elias, standing by the window, turned with fire in his eyes. What do we need to destroy him? Marcus appreciated the directness, the understanding that this was war and wars required strategy, resources, and ruthless execution. We need documentation of abuse, witness testimony, financial records showing he's never contributed to Malik's care, proof that his interest in custody is motivated by money rather than parenting. And we need to dismantle whatever narrative he's building about being a reformed man who deserves a second chance. Sloane entered then, her timing perfect as always, carrying another folder thick with investigation results. Damon Rook has 3 previous restraining orders from 3 different women, 2 involving children, all sealed by settlements that included non-disclosure agreements. But I found the women, and 2 of them are willing to testify if we can guarantee their safety. She spread the evidence across the table like cards in a winning hand. Bank statements showing Damon's gambling debts, text messages he'd sent to Keisha threatening to take Malik, photos of the destroyed apartment, medical records from the night Keisha had collapsed. He's got a criminal history that's been buried by expensive lawyers and well-placed bribes, Sloane continued. Drug possession, assault, fraud, but nothing that stuck because he's connected to people who make problems disappear, and those same people are funding his custody battle because they see Keisha as an easy target who'll fold under pressure. Keisha's hands curled into fists, years of being victimized crystallizing into something harder, something that refused to break anymore. What if he wins? She asked, the question that haunted every nightmare. What if the judge believes his lies? What if they decide I'm unfit because I'm poor, because I live in a bad neighborhood, because I couldn't afford milk for my baby? Marcus leaned forward, his expression softening just slightly. Then we appeal, we fight, we use every legal mechanism available, and we make sure the world knows what kind of man Damon Rook really is. But Keisha, I need you to understand something crucial. He paused, making sure she was really hearing him. This will get ugly. Damon will attack your character, your choices, your fitness as a mother. He'll drag up every mistake you've ever made and present it as evidence of incompetence. And you need to be prepared for that kind of scrutiny. Could someone's entire life be weaponized against them in a courtroom? Could poverty and struggle be reframed as failure rather than survival? Could the system really punish someone for being a victim? Let him try, Keisha said, her voice steady for the first time since this nightmare began. Let him bring everything he's got, because I've got nothing left to lose except my son, and I will burn the whole world down before I let Damon Rook take Malik from me. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 days later in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and broken dreams. And when Keisha walked in flanked by Marcus and Elias, she saw Damon sitting at the opposing table looking clean-cut and remorseful, a performance so convincing it made her stomach turn. He'd shaved, dressed in a modest suit, practiced expressions of wounded fatherhood that would play well for judges who wanted to believe in redemption stories. Victor Salazar, his attorney, was exactly what Marcus had promised, a shark in expensive clothing who smiled like he'd already won. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Kowalski, entered with the weight of someone who'd seen every variation of family court drama and had stopped being surprised by human cruelty decades ago. This is a preliminary hearing to establish temporary custody arrangements while we await the full trial, Judge Kowalski announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who wouldn't tolerate games. Mr. Salazar, present your client's position. Victor stood with practiced grace, his opening statement a masterpiece of manipulation. Your Honor, my client Damon Rook is a father who made mistakes in his youth, but has worked tirelessly to reform himself, to build a stable life, and to establish a relationship with his son Malik. However, he's been systematically denied access by the child's mother, who has used Malik as a weapon to punish Mr. Rook for past relationship difficulties. The lies flowed so smoothly they almost sounded like truth, and Keisha felt panic rising until Marcus stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. Your Honor, the defense will show that Mr. Rook has no interest in parenting and every interest in exploiting his son for financial gain, that he has a documented history of violence against women, that he threatened Ms. Morgan repeatedly, and that his sudden concern for fatherhood coincided suspiciously with learning about potential child support payments. He presented evidence methodically, each piece building on the last, witness statements, financial records, photos of destruction. And through it all Damon sat looking sorrowful and misunderstood, a man being persecuted for trying to do right. Judge Kowalski reviewed everything in silence, her face unreadable, and when she finally spoke the courtroom held its collective breath. I'm ordering supervised visitation for Mr. Rook, 2 hours per week in a monitored facility. And I'm denying the retroactive child support petition pending further investigation into Mr. Rook's claims. We will reconvene in 30 days for a full custody hearing, where both parties will present complete arguments. It wasn't a total victory, but it wasn't defeated either. And as they left the courtroom, Damon caught Keisha's eye, his mask slipping just long enough to show the predator underneath, his smile promising that this was far from over. Outside, Keisha collapsed against the courthouse steps, adrenaline crashing, the temporary reprieve feeling less like safety and more like a ticking clock counting down to the next battle. 30 days, she whispered. 30 days to prove I deserve my own child. Elias sat beside her, their shoulders touching, two people bound by grief and purpose. 30 days to gather everything we need to make sure Damon Rook never threatens you again, he corrected. Marcus is the best, Sloan is relentless, and I will spend every dollar I have to make sure Malik stays exactly where he belongs. Keisha turned to look at him. This stranger who'd become her ally, this billionaire who'd chosen her fight as his own for reasons that transcended logic and entered the territory of something bigger. Why are you doing all this? She asked again, needing to hear the answer one more time. Elias thought about Grace, about the photograph, about the invisible threads that tied people together across time and tragedy. Because 3 years ago, you gave me back something I thought was lost forever, he said quietly. You gave me proof that Grace didn't die alone, that in her final moments someone cared enough to stay. And now it's my turn to make sure you don't face your battles alone either. We're connected, Keisha, by grief and grace and something I don't have words for. But I know that walking away isn't an option anymore. She nodded, tears streaming, and for the first time in years allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight this war by herself. That maybe the universe had finally decided she'd suffered enough and sent help in the form of a grieving billionaire who understood loss and was determined to prevent hers. The 30 days between hearings passed like a storm gathering strength, Marcus building a case so airtight it could withstand any attack, while Keisha tried to maintain some semblance of normal life despite knowing nothing would ever be normal again. She'd moved into a secure apartment Elias had arranged, safer than her previous building, but still modest enough that her pride could accept it as temporary necessity rather than permanent charity. And Malik thrived in ways that broke her heart because she realized how much his health had suffered in that mold-infested prison she'd called home. Sloan worked tirelessly to document everything. tracking down Damon's previous victims, who told stories so similar to Keisha's they could have been reading from the same script, and each testimony added weight to the evidence that Damon Rook was a predator who weaponized fatherhood rather than embraced it. But on day 23, everything shifted when Keisha received an envelope at her new address, unmarked and hand-delivered, containing photos that made her blood run cold. Pictures of Malik at daycare, Malik at the park with Keisha, Malik sleeping through his bedroom window, images that screamed surveillance and violated every sense of safety she tried to rebuild. The message was clear without words. Damon could reach them anywhere, anytime. And all the lawyers and money in the world couldn't stop him from watching, waiting, planning his next move. She called Elias immediately, her voice shaking with rage that had nowhere to go except inward, where it festered like poison. He's having us follow. He's photographing my baby. He's showing me that I'm never safe no matter what protection you think you bought. Elias arrived within 20 minutes, taking one look at the photos before calling both Sloan and Marcus, his face carved from granite, his usual measured calm replaced by something darker and more dangerous. This crosses into stalking and harassment, Marcus said when he saw the evidence. We can file for an emergency restraining order, request enhanced security measures. But Keisha, you need to understand that Damon is escalating because he's losing. Desperate men make desperate moves, and we need to be prepared for him to push harder before the final hearing. The words should have been comforting, but they felt like warnings of storms yet to come. And that night Keisha couldn't sleep, just watched Malik breathe in his crib while paranoia painted shadows into threats, and every sound became potential danger. Could you ever feel safe again once someone showed you how easily they could reach the thing you loved most? Could peace exist when terror had been invited into every moment? The full custody hearing arrived on a gray morning that matched the weight in Keisha's chest, the courtroom packed with people whose faces she didn't recognize, but whose presence suggested Damon had brought reinforcements, character witnesses purchased or coerced into supporting his redemption narrative. Judge Kowalski entered with the same unreadable expression, her gavel falling like a death sentence or salvation, depending on which side you sat. Victor Salazar opened with a performance worthy of awards, painting Damon as a reformed man victimized by circumstance and a vindictive ex-partner. Your Honor, my client acknowledges past mistakes, but has demonstrated consistent effort toward rehabilitation. He's maintained steady employment, completed anger management courses, established a stable residence suitable for a child. And most importantly, he's shown genuine remorse and desire to be present in his son's life. The lies were wrapped in enough truth to sound convincing. Employment records that Sloan had already proven were fabricated. Courses completed online with purchase certificates. An apartment rented specifically for this hearing and never actually lived in. Ms. Morgan, conversely, has shown instability, Victor continued, his tone shifting to attack mode. She's moved residences multiple times, worked inconsistent hours, relied on the financial support of a stranger with unclear motivations, and demonstrated poor judgment in allowing this stranger access to her child without proper vetting. The accusation hung in the air, turning Elias's help into something sinister, suggesting impropriety where there was only compassion, and Keisha felt her carefully constructed defense crumbling under the weight of twisted facts and strategic implications. Marcus stood then, and when he spoke his voice cut through the courtroom like a blade through silk. Your Honor, the defense presents a pattern of abuse, manipulation, and predatory behavior spanning multiple victims and years of carefully hidden violence. He methodically presented each witness, women who testified through tears about Damon's threats, his violence, his obsession with control disguised as love, and with each testimony Damon's mask slipped further until even his own lawyer looked uncomfortable. Mr. Rook has never contributed financially to Malik's care, never attended a medical appointment, never showed interest in his son's well-being until learning about potential child support payments. Marcus continued, presenting bank records, text messages, the photos of surveillance that demonstrated stalking rather than paternal concern. This is not a man seeking to father his child. This is a predator seeking to punish and exploit a woman who dared to escape his control. The evidence mounted like stones on a scale, tilting inexorably toward truth despite Victor's attempts to deflect and reframe, and when Marcus called Keisha to the stand, she walked forward with her spine straight and her voice steady despite every instinct screaming to run. "Ms. Morgan, tell the court about your relationship with Damon Rook," Marcus prompted gently. Keisha took a breath and began, her words painting pictures that made the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Violence described in clinical detail, threats repeated verbatim, fear explained in ways that made strangers understand what it meant to live under constant terror. "He told me if I didn't pay his debts, he would take Malik somewhere I'd never find," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He said I was nothing, that no one would believe me, that the system was built for men like him and against women like me. And for a long time I believed him, because that's what happens when someone breaks you down piece by piece until there's nothing left but fear." Victor cross-examined with the cruelty of someone paid to destroy credibility, questioning her choices, her living situation, her acceptance of help from Elias, trying to paint her as unstable or manipulative or unfit. "Isn't it true you've moved 3 times in 6 months?" he asked, making survival sound like instability. "I moved because Damon kept finding me," Keisha replied, refusing to be shaken. "I moved because staying meant risking my son's safety." The cross-examination continued for an hour, Victor searching for cracks in her story, contradictions in her timeline, anything that could be used to undermine her credibility. But Keisha had lived this nightmare and knew every detail, with the precision of trauma burned into memory. When she finally stepped down, Elias caught her eye from the gallery, silent support radiating from him like heat, and she drew strength from knowing at least one person believed her completely. Judge Kowalski called a recess to review evidence, and the waiting felt eternal. Minutes stretching into hours as Keisha paced the courthouse hallway wondering if the system would protect her or punish her for being poor and vulnerable. When they were called back, the judge's face remained unreadable until the gavel fell, and she spoke with authority that left no room for appeal. "I find the evidence against Mr. Rook overwhelming, and his claims of reformed character unconvincing. Supervised visitation is hereby terminated. Full custody is awarded to Ms. Morgan, and Mr. Rook is ordered to have no contact with either Ms. Morgan or the child pending investigation into stalking and harassment charges." Victory crashed over Keisha like a wave, 3 years of terror ending in a single declaration, and she collapsed into her seat as tears finally came, relief and disbelief and exhausted joy mixing into something that felt suspiciously like hope. Damon stood, his face contorted with rage barely contained, his voice rising despite his lawyers' attempts to silence him. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but I will destroy you. I will take everything from you. I will make you regret ever breathing." Security moved forward as Judge Kowalski's gavel fell like thunder. "Mr. Rook, you are in contempt of court and your threats have been recorded. Bailiffs, please escort him out and ensure he's held pending criminal evaluation." Damon fought as they grabbed him, his veneer of respectability shattering completely as he screamed obscenities, and Keisha watched the man who'd haunted her nightmares being dragged away, still making threats that had finally lost their power. Outside the courthouse, Marcus shook her hand with professional pride while Sloan nodded approval. Their work complete. Justice served in a system that rarely delivered it. And Keisha held Malik close, breathing in his baby scent, while understanding that this was the first day of a life she'd stopped believing possible. Elias stood apart, giving her space to process, and when she looked at him, she saw not a savior but a partner, someone who'd walked beside her through hell and asked nothing except that she keep fighting. "Thank you," she said, the words insufficient for the debt she owed, but all she had to offer. "No," Elias replied softly, thinking of Grace and photographs and impossible connections that felt ordained rather than accidental. "Thank you for showing me that some things are worth fighting for even when the outcome is uncertain. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to care about something bigger than grief." 6 months after the courthouse victory, Keisha still woke, sometimes expecting to find Damon's shadow in her doorway. Muscle memory of fear taking longer to heal than the actual threat. But Malik was thriving in ways that rewrote her understanding of what motherhood could look like without terror as a constant companion. She'd kept her job at the diner despite not needing it financially anymore because routine mattered, normalcy mattered, proving to herself that she could build something sustainable rather than remaining dependent on Elias's generosity felt essential to reclaiming the identity trauma had stolen. Damon faced charges that would keep him occupied with his own survival for years. His network of enablers, scattered once prosecutors, started investigating the people who'd funded his legal battles. And though Keisha knew men like him rarely disappeared completely, she also understood that his power had been broken in ways that mattered. Elias had stepped back after the trial, giving her space to rebuild without his constant presence. But they'd maintained connection through weekly coffee meetings that felt less like charity and more like friendship forged in shared purpose. It was during one of those meetings that he mentioned the foundation, his voice carrying uncertainty, like someone testing ice for thickness. I've been thinking about Grace, about what she would want her legacy to be, and I keep coming back to the fact that she died with a stranger's kindness as her final comfort. Keisha listened, knowing where this was heading before he said the words, understanding that Elias needed purpose as much as she needed protection. I want to create something that helps single mothers, survivors of abuse, people trapped in systems that punish poverty and reward predators, he continued. Passion replacing uncertainty. A foundation that provides legal support, housing assistance, childcare, healthcare, everything that you needed but couldn't access because the resources don't exist for people who need the most. The idea bloomed between them, taking shape through conversations that stretched across weeks, and Keisha found herself drawn into planning despite initial resistance because she understood these struggles from the inside, knew exactly what would actually help versus what sounded good on paper but failed in practice. It should be called the Grace and Keisha Foundation, Elias proposed one afternoon, and she immediately shook her head. Grace was your wife. I was just someone who sat with her for 2 hours. Elias smiled sadly, that expression he wore when remembering his wife mixed with gratitude for Keisha's presence in that final moment. You gave her peace when I couldn't. You gave me a gift I didn't know I'd received until I saw that photograph. Your name belongs there because this whole thing started with your kindness 3 years ago and your courage now. The foundation launched on the anniversary of Grace's death, a date that had marked grief but now represented transformation. And the event was held in a venue that felt too large until Keisha saw how many people filled the seats, survivors and advocates and donors who believed in the mission. She stood backstage in a dress Elias had insisted on buying, her hands trembling with nerves that felt different from fear, anticipation rather than dread coloring the butterflies in her stomach. You don't have to speak if you're not ready, Elias said gently, reading her anxiety accurately. This is your foundation too, but there's no pressure to be public about your story. Keisha looked at him, this man who'd become her unexpected anchor, who'd proven that sometimes strangers showed up at exactly the right moment and changed everything. I need to speak, she said, her voice steadying with conviction. I need people to know that survival is possible, that the system can work if enough people demand it works, that we don't have to accept abuse and poverty and terror as inevitable. She walked onto that stage with Malik on her hip, her son's healthy weight and bright eyes testament to what 6 months of safety could accomplish. And when she reached the microphone, the crowd fell silent with the kind of attention that recognized something important was about to be said. 3 years ago, I held a dying woman's hand in a hospital because I couldn't walk past someone suffering alone, Keisha began, her voice carrying across the room without wavering. I was pregnant and scared and dealing with my own crisis, but something in me understood that we're all connected by the threads of our pain and our capacity for compassion. She told Grace's story, told her own story, wove them together until people understood the impossible coincidence that had brought her and Elias into each other's lives at exactly the moment both needed saving. For years I believed I was worthless because someone told me I believed I deserved the abuse because I'd been conditioned to accept cruelty as normal. I believed asking for help was weakness rather than wisdom. Her words landed in hearts around the room, stories recognized by anyone who'd ever felt trapped or worthless or completely alone. This foundation exists because one person chose to see me, chose to believe me, chose to fight for me, when I'd stopped fighting for myself. And now we're creating a system where that kind of help isn't dependent on luck or coincidence, but is available to everyone who needs it. The applause started slowly, then built into something thunderous. People standing, crying, recognizing themselves in her story, or recognizing someone they'd failed to help. Elias joined her on stage, his presence beside her feeling right in ways that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with shared purpose. Two broken people who'd found meaning in each other's healing. Grace would be proud of this, he said, addressing the crowd with emotion thick in his voice. She always believed in helping people, in showing up for strangers, in making the world softer for those who suffered, and this foundation honors her memory by continuing that work. He detailed the programs they developed: legal aid for custody battles, housing assistance for those fleeing abuse, medical care for children whose parents couldn't afford it, job training and child care, and mental health support, a comprehensive safety net designed by people who'd lived without one. We're starting here, but the goal is expansion. Every city should have access to these resources. Every person trapped in impossible circumstances should know that help exists and is available without judgment or conditions. The evening concluded with testimonials from women who'd already benefited from early foundation work. Stories of custody won and safety achieved and lives rebuilt. Each one proof that systematic change was possible when resources met genuine understanding of need. Afterward, Keisha stood on the balcony looking over the city, Malik asleep in a carrier against her chest, exhaustion mixing with satisfaction in ways that felt earned rather than given. Elias found her there, two people who'd been strangers 9 months ago, now bound by experiences that transcended normal friendship. "Did we do the right thing?" she asked, vulnerability showing through the confidence she displayed on stage. Putting our stories out there, making ourselves public, inviting scrutiny into lives that have already been scrutinized too much. Elias considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think we gave hope to people who'd stopped believing in it," he said finally. "I think we showed that transformation is possible even after tragedy, that connections matter even when they seem impossible, that sometimes the universe puts people in each other's paths for reasons we don't understand until much later." Could two broken people heal each other without falling in love? Could grief and gratitude create bonds as strong as romance? Could purpose replace numbness and meaning emerge from tragedy? "Grace would have liked you," Elias added softly, thinking about his wife who died with a stranger's kindness as her final gift. "She would have loved your strength, your dignity, your refusal to stay broken even when breaking seemed easier." Keisha smiled, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I wish I'd known her better. Wish I'd understood in that moment how much those 2 hours would matter. Wish I could have told her that her husband would someday save my life because she'd shown me that strangers could be kind." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights blur through emotional exhaustion. Two people who'd collided in grief and found something that looked like redemption. Damon Rook faced trial in 3 months, his future looking appropriately bleak. His victims finally believed and protected by the same system that had failed them for so long. Sloan had moved on to other cases, but remained on retainer for the foundation, her investigative skills ensuring that help reached those who needed it most. Marcus continued legal work through the foundation, winning custody battles and protective orders with the same precision he'd used for Keisha. Grace's memory lived in every person helped, every life changed, every moment of kindness extended to strangers who desperately needed it. Malik would grow up never knowing the terror that had defined his first months, never understanding how close he'd come to being weaponized by a predator, never carrying the weight his mother had carried because she'd fought through hell to give him something better. The foundation grew exponentially, media coverage bringing attention and funding, survivors sharing stories that inspired others to seek help, and slowly the culture shifted toward believing victims rather than questioning them, toward supporting survivors rather than abandoning them. Keisha became an advocate, her voice carrying authority because she'd lived what she spoke about. And though public life was uncomfortable, she understood its necessity, knew that visibility mattered when so many suffered in shadows. Elias found purpose again after 3 years of numbness. Grace's death transformed from ending into beginning, and though grief never completely disappeared, it evolved into something gentler, something that coexisted with joy rather than consuming it. What started in a grocery store with a declined card and a sick baby had become a movement, proof that individual acts of courage could ripple outward and change systems, that connections forged in crisis could become foundations for transformation, that sometimes the universe arranged collisions between broken people specifically so they could help each other heal. Keisha looked down at Malik, his peaceful sleep testament to safety achieved and battles won, and whispered promises into his hair about the life she'd build for him, the world she'd helped create where people like her received help before desperation, where children were protected rather than weaponized, where kindness wasn't dependent on coincidence, but was woven into systems designed to catch people before they fell. The night ended with Elias and Keisha standing together looking at the city they'd helped transform. Two people who'd been strangers brought together by grief and grace, and the invisible threads that connect all human suffering. And though nothing about their story was simple or clean or easily categorized, it was real, and it mattered, and it proved that sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that defy definition. The bonds forged not in romance, but in shared purpose, in mutual rescue, in the revolutionary act of showing up for each other when the world expected them to fight alone, and that more than any fairy tale ending, was the kind of love that actually changed lives. This story comes to the end here. Please make sure to subscribe to my channel and tell me what you loved in the video.